Right. Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing crappy core training. So we want to cover things like what is core training, when to maybe use certain exercises and how to implement them, and why sit-ups might be shit for you. So, but before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our sponsor, Wit Fitness. If you saw on Instagram, there's a new range out, the Summer 2021 collection. So do check it out. Visit www.wit-fitness.com. Use the code LL15 for a cheeky 15% off. And do tag us online if you do purchase anything, and we'd like to see you in that get-up. So, Ash, let's set the scene.
Mm-hmm.
What is core training?
Core training is training your core. Simple as that.
Really? What is your core, Ash? What is your core?
Your core is a catch-all term applied to your midsection, essentially. So generally, your abs, your obliques, your transverse abdominis, which is
TBM.
a mythical, deep core muscle, and it's essentially anything that conditions your trunk in any way, shape, or form.
Your lower back.
Yeah, your lower back would fall into that as well. And people approach it in many different weird and wonderful ways. And we're sort of going to go through a few of those and look at whether they're actually worth your while or not.
Nice. So I guess it'd be quite interesting to maybe think about what ways you can actually target your core. So the reason why I threw in that little thing there, it does your lower back count, because when people say core training, they basically just mean ab training. So they pretty much mean just the front of the body, even though the core is your full midsection. A lot of people actually forget about their lower back as part of that core training. But being there are many ways to do it, I guess you have to think of your planes of motion, right? So because you're going to think about one, how you're being challenged. And what also you're doing your, say, core training for. Are you doing it for a sport? Are you doing it for aesthetics? Are you just doing it because you think you should do it? Are you doing it as maybe like a rehab that you've fucked your back and you think, right, I now need to do some core training? There are so many reasons to be able to do it. So things like rotation, so making sure you include rotation within your training, anti-rotation, so trying not to rotate. There's obviously isometrics, things like planks, side planks. There's the Bosu balls, which we know we like to see many of those thrown around. Medicine balls, which you can do some pretty cool exercises on as well. But the pad-off presses, which again, that's focused a lot on anti-rotation a lot of the time because you're holding a fixed position. And I think you've also got hanging leg raises, I'd say, is that like flexion, and of course the classic sit-ups. So I guess, like I mentioned at the start, understand why. It's just that common theme. Why are you doing it? Like, why are you doing it in the first place? So why would you be performing core exercises? I touched on some of the bit there, but maybe dive a little bit deeper here.
Sure. I think they rose to stardom in the exercise world because they're very closely linked to reducing lower back pain. There's some good research to show that if somebody has improved their core strength, it can relieve and potentially prevent lower back pain from coming on. And the mechanism by which that happens is basically that you are able to prevent uncontrolled motions of the spine. So if you've got a slipped disc, it'll avoid you getting surprise pressure applied to that. And equally, if that's pressing on, they've got some sort of cord compression or any nerve pain, again, the sort of the surprised, uncontrolled motion is what causes a lot of back pain. So the idea being that if your core is stronger and more stable, you're less likely to move into those uncontrolled positions by surprise, so you experience less pain. And I think the other main argument for including core training is an effective transfer of force from the lower to the upper body or vice versa. And it just means your shoulder girdle is connected to your pelvis more tightly. So you leak less energy through that midsection. And I guess that's an interesting comparison between those 2 points, is that the stabilization of the spine is trying to prevent motion, whereas in sports, we're controlling that motion. So we're acknowledging that we do want some motion when transferring force from the hips to the shoulders. So immediately we've got a bit of conflict there as to what do we want the core to do. Do we want it to be still so the spine doesn't move too much, or do we want it to move and help transfer force from the ground to the upper extremities? So
yeah. You're telling me you don't do sit-ups to get a six-pack?
Oh yeah, you can do sit-ups to get a six-pack. There's nothing wrong with that.
Just checking. Just check I'm not wasting my time then. Still not working, but I'm just checking. No, so it's a really interesting point, because I mentioned earlier about like anti-rotation, and obviously anti-rotation, especially if you're, say, like a power lifter or someone a strength athlete that wants to make sure they're nice and strong through their midline, that whole core area. Anti-rotation is obviously going to be great for if you've got a heavy load in your back, stopping that bar from twisting, because you have the ability. But I also guess you need to then train your rotation as well, because that load, when you can't stop the anti-rotation anymore and that body starts to rotate, when maybe you're coming out of a squat and you're finding what muscles can I do to get this final part of the rep, you're going to need to strengthen those positions, right?
Yeah. So as always, we come back to what are we training the core for? What's the why for why we're training our core in the first place? If you are a barbell athlete, then you don't want a huge amount of motion through the spine. You generally want it to be quite stiff and rigid so it doesn't rotate, it doesn't flex, and we control the bar to move as close to vertically as we can. So those are reasons for why you might train stillness and anti-rotation to resist forces taking you away from optimal bar path and mechanics. However, in normal life, all those spinal movements are normal and natural. So even in walking, we get flexion extension, we get left and right lateral flexion, and we get left and right rotation in part of the gait cycle. So by completely removing that motion, as we said in our hypermobility podcast, whenever there's stiffness, then it will usually lead to hypermobility somewhere else, and vice versa. So if your spine is incredibly stiff, then you're going to need extra motion from somewhere else to maintain your full movement capacity. And that could be within the spine itself. So if you've stiffened up most of your spine, but one junction in vertebrae will end up doing a whole spine's worth of motion. So this is where we see pivot points that we discussed then, where say your spine doesn't flex left or right apart from T12L1, the junction between your thoracic and lumbar spine. That joint can get massively overused because it's the only one giving you any lateral flexion in the whole back, which isn't ideal. And that's where things like slip discs can occur and just literally wearing out the bone of the spine. And that is a consideration. Be aware that if you are training your spine to be super stiff, that movement might get found in another part of the body. So there is a price to pay.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because obviously most of my training over the years has been pretty much the anti-rotation to build a strong and stable torso as possible to perform these heavy lifts. Obviously now getting into like say swimming and running and stuff like that, swimming I found is where I'm supposed to rotate, and I was lucky enough to actually have a friend of mine give me some coaching with some swimming, and he filmed me doing the length, and it's so funny. Just in my head I thought I was getting this like beautiful high elbow with my right side, which I was, but then my left side I thought I was getting the same thing, and I was basically just skimming the water. And it's just because I felt I had that rotation, but then I realized as soon as I get tired, I then stop rotating from say the torso, the hip, and I basically just throw my head sideways and basically craning myself out the water, because I was then lacking that stability through my torso while I'm swimming. So I'm then sinking and I'm then yanking my head out the water. So I'm just putting myself in this compromising position, which is just going to get me more and more tired the longer I do it. And it's just funny because it's now, this is the why am I doing say certain things, and now training rotation, doing these things, I need to be doing a lot more of this because it's now more applicable to the sport that I'm choosing to follow at the moment. So
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that's a perfect illustration of the price you pay from doing lots of barbell work, is that you've trained to not rotate for a really long time. And now that you need to rotate, you're finding it a lot harder. And I think the classic example of this for me is when you watch CrossFitters run. Like if you at the CrossFit Games, all athletes who make it to the CrossFit Games are in unbelievable shape and they can do incredible things with the barbell. And the price for that is quite a stiff thoracic spine that doesn't rotate very well. So if you compare and contrast a CrossFitter running to a runner running, one of the main things you'll notice is a huge difference in how much their spines rotate as they run. So a runner will get a lot more thoracic rotation as compared to a CrossFitter whose arms will basically swing around a pretty fixed spine. And that means running is less of a full body movement as compared to a runner. They're not able to use as much of their full body musculature to flow through the skill of running. And that's more optimal for the sport of CrossFit as an overall, to have that trade-off, be worse at running, be better with a barbell, but it is not optimal for running. And this is, a trade-off in its purest form, that you've sacrificed in one area to be better in another. And being aware of those trade-offs, I think, is just that awareness allows you to be better informed with which trade-offs you want to make with your body. Like if you now have decided that you want to do more triathlons, then maybe you're going to reduce the amount of core stillness training you're going to do and favor a little bit more rotation to allow for lunges, T-spine work to just improve your ability to get that left elbow a bit higher when you're swimming.
I found it really fascinating. It's been such an interesting journey so far of just also where I'm then essentially detraining myself from, say, strength training, and I've then allowed running has become so much, it's still hard, but so much easier because I can relax more. So that rigidity, I'm actually, that rotation that you're saying, that, so I'm still not quite a runner, and I don't want to be a runner, but this thing, I'm now allowing my body to get into these positions.
Much disdain.
I know, but it's just extremely interesting because it's been such a real world example for me, going from one extreme to the other. And then when I come back to strength training, I wonder, having now this extra range that I've never really had before, when I then add in a lot more, say, rigidity into my training, what happens to, obviously the rotation will start to leak away a little bit more because now I'm going back towards that strength training. But does it then improve my strength training at the top end because I now have more rotation? So I have a stronger rotation. I have the ability to rotate a little, even though that's not what you want from squatting. I just wonder if what I'm gaining here is going to help me later, and I'm only going to wait to find out. So
I think you're specializing in another direction. So I think it's, in that instance, I would say they're competing demands on the body, in that having great spinal rotation for running is not what you want for a stiff upper back for deadlifting.
Definitely not. So I guess that how should we train these movements? Because as we've said there, it's you need to know what sport or what activity you're doing. So obviously making sure that you know the target, you know the goal, so then we can make sure our movements will either assist or, maybe there's just a little bit of extra fluff work if you've got some extra time. So
great question. So as always, we got to distill it down to what's the function that we're trying to improve. So what's the function of your core in your chosen sport or training? So if it is a barbell sport, then as we just said, stiffness is adaptive so that we can stabilize and control the barbell, get the legs and hips doing as much of the work as possible, and have as little leakage of energy through the whole kinetic chain as we can. So if we're looking at something like a back squat, how can we train the core in a similar way to how it's used in the back squat. Stuff like yoke carries are phenomenal because
I
you
love
can
them.
go back rack loaded as well,
Yeah.
and it's a very similar position to how the bar would be loaded on your back in a back squat, and you can go heavier than you could go in a back squat. So resisting that motion and controlling it as you plod along has a great carryover to your back squat as compared to something like a sit up
Yeah.
where gravity's in another direction. You're training flexion of the spine rather than stillness.
Yeah.
And I think just having that simple lens of what looks most like the exercise that I want my core to be good in. And it's a great test. I know you like your D-ball good mornings for deadlifts.
Yeah, for me, I love. I think as an accessory, like the thing with a D, you can hold like weight plates and stuff like that. But the reason I like a D ball is the awkwardness of it. So that you're having to create this like tension through the body and hold that while you're then doing a good morning. So anyone that doesn't know what a good morning is, essentially doing a bow. All right, so essentially like a remaining deadlift, but I think it's called a good morning because it's like someone bending over saying good morning. But for those that didn't know that, but with the D-ball good morning in particular, I've personally found from my own experience and with clients that you get a really good hinge if you do it correctly. And I think this is then where this core stability, because the amount of say tension that you have to create through the body to hold that frontal loaded D-ball, so you're holding that into position. It normally goes right or wrong, and it's very clear straight because literally the very first thing is either someone bends from the back or they load from the hip, and this is obviously then this could go into a whole different episode. But with this particular thing, we obviously want to make sure our core is stiff with that exercise, so we're loading the hips and using the hip to do the brunt of the force, but we're using then the D-ball to give us that feedback of that extra load, and because of with the deadlift, the weight is in front of you. So that's how we want to be stabilizing. So for me, a D-ball good morning is like you can load a lot less and get similar sort of stress through the body. So don't get me wrong, it's obviously not the same as an exact deadlift, but we want to think about, as we mentioned there, how close to the movement can we keep it? And that's then using like a nice fun bit of kit, something like a D-ball. So not only does it make it a bit more interesting, but it's not just interesting for the sake of, oh, this is fun, let's just do something stupid. It has a carryover.
Exactly. It's a similar movement pattern, but with a greater emphasis placed on the core, essentially. So you're overloading the area of the body that you want to receive the most benefit.
I prefer them to like a barbell good morning, because I think with a barbell, so when you put a barbell in your back rack, so across your traps, I find most people just either one, you can barely get that much load through that anyway. And it's also incredibly hard for a lot of people to stabilize that weight and then hinge over, because you have to think that weight is essentially trying to decapitate you the whole time. So it's not really that comfortable. So then you normally crane your neck up to kind of give you this extra bit of support. But then if we're then talking about how close to the deadlift are we, that's not what your deadlift should be looking like. So that's why I say with something like the D-ball good morning, because I think the good morning is a great exercise. I just think the loading of a barbell in the back rack probably could be improved. So
fair point. Carrying on with how we should train our core, that's sort of for barbell sports, training it as close to the barbell movements that you want to work on is always the principle, and just having an emphasis on what aspect of the core you're trying to focus on as well will dictate the loading style. For non-barbell sports, then we are looking for more motion. So if you think of like running, throwing, jumping, or swinging a golf club or a tennis racket, all of those need a spine that moves. And actually, if your spine doesn't move enough, like we said earlier, something else will have to move more or deal with more force, which is a common mechanism for shoulder injuries. Say a spine doesn't move, the shoulder has to move extra and can easily be overloaded. This is really common in baseball or tennis, where somebody's trying to hit a ball as hard as possible, but because the spine doesn't move, the trunk can't decelerate those forces, so they all end up in the extremities, and the shoulder is the next nearest neighbor to deal with those forces. So rather than just focusing on the classic flexion extension exercises like sit-ups, we can go more into rotation. Stuff like standing Russian twists are a great go-to. You get the benefit of being on your feet as well, and that carries over to anything in sport. Or lunges with a rotation are obviously going to be high up my list because they carry over to gait. And the closer you can get to your sport, as always, like if you play hockey, then getting into a hockey style setup is going to have a great carryover whenever you do that rotation work, which replicates striking a ball from that stance.
Yeah, I think what I think should be thought about here though is this kind of reminds me of people then trying to do the sport as close as possible, and this is when I then think of like a Bosu ball with this resistance band, and this is like you're then going so far away in a way just to make this fancy exercise. And I think where it can get a bit confusing as well is don't be afraid to do things that other people aren't, because I think the example there of doing what's appropriate for your sport, but because everyone is doing hanging leg raises and sit-ups, and you're in a CrossFit gym, so maybe butterfly sit-ups, and you're doing all these exercises, and I think movement standards was an absolute bastardization of core training, because toes to bar, it was probably one of my biggest gripes with I love CrossFit, I really do, but toes to bar for most people just stops being an abs exercise, which is what they're doing it for. And I would always notice then obviously how whenever I'm performing them, it's a hell of a lot of upper body, because I was not proficient at them, a lot of lats anyway, hip flexors, everything going in, and so I'd get some ab. Whereas when I reduced that range of motion and actually did maybe just above parallel leg raises, keeping that hollow body, like the tension I would build up in my abs was insane. And for core training, like for direct ab flexion training, it was perfect, like doing it like that. But obviously within a CrossFit workout, that's not necessarily appropriate because there's movement standards, and that's why they're there, so everyone is doing the same thing. But the problem is, I think when we're then out of that workout environment, and we're not necessarily trying to get better at toes to bar, we're just trying to improve, do some core training overall to just build up a stronger midline, that then we're still trying to do toes to bar. And it's and it just, I find that as something to have a little think about, because you need to understand, I hate keep saying it, but you need to understand why you're doing what you're doing, but also not be then afraid that if everyone's doing some butterfly sit-ups and stuff like that, that might be appropriate because they're doing a workout. Don't be afraid to do these more functional core exercises which are closer to your chosen sport, your chosen whatever, to get the better bang for your buck. Because at the end of the day, we've all got a certain amount of time we can spend in the gym. So I think it's the, not embarrassment, but it's doing this maybe a lunge with a rotation and stuff like that, say as an example, it looks different. People are becoming a lot more receptive to different, but it's still taking time. And people are like, well, no, you could just do that. You could do a GHD sit-up. Well, actually, what are your thoughts on GHD sit-ups? Just, sorry, it's a little sidetrack, but for me, only reason because I've experienced them from your own coaching as well. So when I do GHD sit-ups, I used to keep my eyes up the whole time and kind of always try and look at the sky above. So as I was doing it, it'd keep this whole load of tension through my stomach, and it'd essentially cone it in a way, right? But I'd keep a lot of tension and my hands would touch the floor. But then I'd end up in pain. But then when I relaxed my head and had it go backwards, I'd get dizzy from going backwards and forwards so many times. But I got a much better contraction. Do you think GHD sit-ups are a good exercise to do?
So you're using a glute ham developer to train your abs. Just okay. Just
let's leave that there. That's
what's going on. So it's a CrossFit movement, and I really like the point you're making just now about movement standards and the toes to bar, where essentially the movement standard has driven you to move away from the intended stimulus. So the toes to bar was designed as an exercise with the intended stimulus being training your abs, getting flexion through the spine to train anterior and abdominals. But because you're focusing on getting your toes to touch the bar, it's become a lat and hip flexor exercise and much less of an ab exercise. So we are now moving away from the stimulus for the sake of competition, and that's fine as long as you're aware of that's why you're doing it. If you do want to train your abs, then you make the right decision and reduce the range of motion to keep the work in the areas that you want to challenge. If we apply this logic to the GHD, why are we doing it in the first place? Are we doing it competitively, or are we doing it to train your abs? One thing I like about it is that it does get you into extension. So a lot of core training is from neutral to flexion and never into extension of the spine. So if you do GHDs and let yourself open up, you can get into a nice extended hip and trunk, so you get a better stretch through the abs in the sagittal plane. So that is a good thing about the GHD. So from an aesthetic point of view, you're going to get a really good ab workout from doing that in the same way that you would from, Rocky style, hanging over the edge of the balcony in the wood cabin, the log cabin. So yeah, you can get a really strong ab stimulus to get your six pack going. In terms of how functional is it for life? Like, if we assume that CrossFit is trying to use functional movements which prepare you for life, I don't think it's that functional for life. There aren't many situations where you are hanging from your feet with your hips supported, leaning backwards, except maybe if you're Rocky. So I don't think the carryover to life is huge, but I think it's a good way to get some abs. And yeah,
I guess maybe if you're lying on the floor, you're falling over, you've got to throw yourself up and you can't use your legs. I guess that might also be an option, but...
yeah, exactly. So in some very specific circumstances, I think it's a functional movement. But generally, if we can train our abs in extension with our feet on the floor, then I'd class that as a bigger win or more relevant to life. And so, like running, you want to train your abs in extension. So doing like a reverse lunge with your hands overhead, you should get a stretch through your abs.
Beautiful stretch.
And
I love it.
Yeah, that replicates a lot more of the mechanics of gates than hanging through your feet.
Yeah, some good points there. And I think it's with movement standards as a whole, and obviously we want to link this to, say, core training. It's, if you are competing and you're in a workout and stuff like that, then do exactly what it states on the tin. You're supposed to touch the bars, because if we didn't and we just did a hanging leg raise, everyone's legs are, say, different lengths, so speeds are going to be different and everything. Whereas with the toes to bar, everyone has to get from A to B, and then it's easy to judge and everything. And I just think when we do competitive exercises for a non-competitive reason, that's where the lines get blurred. And that's then when we start to ask, even like with, like, say, the anti-rotation exercise and stuff like that I mentioned earlier, it's like, they're absolutely amazing to do, but you do need to remember that most of life is rotation. This is why you don't like when someone picks something up off the floor and they say they do their back in. They're not because they didn't brace before they hinged over, and like, you should be able to flex at the lower back and pick something up and not be worried if you're picking up, say, something like, I don't know, like a bag of crisps or a pencil or something. I don't know, something, right? Yeah. But I'm just thinking about the office environment. But not sure why they'd be crisp on the floor in the office environment. Maybe they got the meal deal at lunchtime and dropped them. So, but do you know what I mean? It's like that's what we need to be thinking about. And it's like, doing these exercises are great to incorporate within your training, especially for variation and just for fun, because that's what a lot of training should be. Especially with core training, it can be quite, say, tedious, I think, for a lot of people. And I think because people, it's quite often looked as the extra stuff, the fluff work, even though it's far from fluff work. For me, the way I've always treated core training is, that's my back squat, my deadlift, and my bench press. Do you know what I mean? That was my core training. And whenever I'm doing any accessories, bracing and stuff like that. So the amount that I brace, but this is now where we mentioned at the start, how I've taken my say the possibility to have a nice, rotation through my mid back, say, to losing that completely and basically all being completely stiff. So now when I twist, it's just the whole back moves, and then it just puts so much pressure on at the end of the spine, which is why I've had then, say, lower back issues over the time. So, but yeah. Any other points you want to add in on this, mate?
I think that's it. I think, generally speaking, the body likes to move. So if we can retain the capacity to move in as many different directions as possible for general health, I think that's better. Obviously, if you're specializing in a sport, then you're specializing in a sport. So you're making your body a finely tuned instrument for those specific purposes, and there will be trade-offs. But I think a lot of people think that that is what a core should do. So they go into their training thinking that any movement of the spine is a bad thing. And don't get me wrong, under a super heavy deadlift, we don't want loads of uncontrolled motion at all. But when you're picking up a bag of crisps, then you should be comfortable and able to flex your spine to do so, rather than doing that meme of the guy who does everything functionally, where he's like hip hinging to sit down and like bracing his core before he opens the top cupboard. That's not what we want to get to. So
I remember that meme. It's great meme.
Yeah. So yeah, one other point actually I wanted to talk about was neutral spine. So neutral is like the reasons we do neutral spine, or talk about neutral spine in training, is you want to be in the center of your range of motion so that you can flex and extend out of it if you need to correct. If you're maximally flexed or maximally extended, you've got nowhere to go because you're at your end range by definition. So when you're lifting something and you have a slight wobble, you want to be able to correct in both directions, and being in the middle of the range gives you the maximum room for error in either direction. The other reason you want neutral spine is to evenly distribute that workload across the whole spine rather than having it focus on one specific angle. So if you've got a kink in your lower back, that will be taking most of the force, and that again is how you can get things like slip discs, because all that force is being expressed in one part rather than evenly distributed across the whole spine. However, as we were saying before, by only training that one fixed position, you then can either create a hypermobility somewhere else where it's trying to make up for the missing movement, or you struggle with things like swimming or running, which do require you to come out of neutral regularly. So just be aware of that trade-off. So I still do talk about neutral spine when teaching people the basics of lifting, and awareness of what it is and where it is important. But I don't think people need to be as precious as they sometimes are about maintaining neutral spine always.
Yeah, and I think just to slightly add on to that as well is the understanding bracing and understanding how to brace that. Even if the spine is flexed, you can still have a braced midline. So that normally bracing is essentially just, if you imagine, if you don't know what it is, it's like doing a plank, but while you're, say, moving, which is obviously functional. So that is a functional plank in a way, being able to brace. So if you imagine you're about to be punched in the stomach and you don't want to get winded, you're going to squeeze your stomach. I wonder how many of you just squeezed your stomach just then. So imagine you're about to be punched, you're going to squeeze because you don't want to get winded. That's bracing. And being able to then move and still talk. So I'm bracing right now while I'm talking. But that's the thing, is being able to have that nice, strong, say, tight core while doing things. Like even like when it come into rotation, understanding how to slightly ease off some of that brace, but still understand tension. And that's where I think, if you think like spaghetti, you don't want to have a spaghetti back. You don't want it to be soft. You don't want it to be hard, because then it breaks really easy. So you want to have that little mid. You want it just so it starts to soften.
Al dente.
Yeah, so it's got a little bit of firmness to it. But yeah, so thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate all the feedback we've been getting recently. It means a lot. If you do have any feedback that you want to share to the world, we really appreciate it on our Apple Podcast or on YouTube, or just drop us a message. We always like to have a little read. And as always, thank you very much for giving us your time. We appreciate that there's plenty of stuff to be listening to, so it's giving us 30 to 60 minutes of your week. it means a lot to us. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Ash. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.